Hi, I'm Garmbreak1, and this is Midgardia's Cool Crowdfunding Show. I'm here today with Bradley. How's it going?
Hey, I'm good, Garm. Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you. So, are you here today to tell us about Convictor Drive? Convictor Drive Armored by Grief. I had to double check the subtitle. So,
Yeah,
why don't you
yeah,
tell?
that's exactly what I'm here to talk about today. And yes, the name is a mouthful. I think that the name is pretty awesome, but it's quite at minimum, quite the subtitle.
Absolutely. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Convictor Drive is it's from the same design circle that did the last ttrpg localization project that we kickstarted, Picaresque Roman. That design circle being named Group SGR. So we have experience with Group SGR, and we're back for round two with them for Convictor Drive. Now, Convictor Drive is very different than Picaresque Roman, our last TTRPG, Japanese TTRPG, in that it's a little bit more of a straightforward game. But I'll get into that in a little bit. So Convictor Drive, Armored by Grief, is a tokusatsu-inspired, action-packed investigation and fighting big bad guys type of role-playing game. So comes with an original system, beautiful anime art, really, really awesome lore. About 30 pages of super dense, fascinating, creative lore to explain its world and its setting, and all of the technology that sort of drives the main narrative and mechanical devices that are at play in the game. And it's primarily inspired by Kamen Rider, but there's absolutely some Ultraman in there, Super Sentai, My Hero Academia, some Iron Man. So lots of inspirations came together to create Convictor Drive, which is very much so like Group SGR, and more specifically, very much so like the game's core designer, Sigre-san. Um, a lot of his inspirations, a lot of what he likes can be felt in his games. Our last game, Picaresque Roman, he liked Persona and Yakuza, and it very much so feels like that and looks like that. And Convictor Drive is the same way. Convictor Drive's got some cool stuff going for it. It's a little bit crunchy, which is also different than our last TTRPG, which was a very narrative heavy type game with not very much crunch at all. And it's essentially about just suiting up in big old power suits, taking down dastardly villains, and saving the day.
Right on. Yeah, no, I quite like Kamen Rider. It's come up on this channel many a time. Um, is this? I assume since this is very much in line with that, more than like Super Sentai. This is a bit darker and grittier, is that correct?
Yeah, so I think people hear tokusatsu and they think really big, over the top, big special effects, maybe a little bit of camp, maybe a little bit of cheese, maybe a little bit of like B movie action. And certainly you could probably set up Convictor Drive to play like that. And there are even elements kind of hidden away in the corners and pockets of Convictor Drive where you can see that element of tokusatsu, but I would say that this game, this world, this take on tokusatsu is a lot more serious. There's it's grounded as much as tokusatsu can be grounded, I suppose. And it is a bit darker, but it hits on some very human themes that I think a lot of us can relate to, and that's actually what kind of drew me to the that's what drew me to the game. So you could probably play it to be a little goofy, but I'm not exactly sure it was designed that way.
Right, right. More in line with Kamen Rider Gaim than like Kamen Rider Double then.
Perfectly put.
How literal is that subtitle, Armored by Grief?
Yeah, pretty literal. We actually we weren't quite sure if we were going to keep the subtitle as it was, or if we were going to retool it in the localization process. And we threw out a whole bunch of names that sort of kept the essence and the vibe of the original translation, the transliteration. But ultimately, we came back to Armored by Grief as just sounding really unique and very cool. And I had like a personal attachment to it just because it reminded me of a band that I liked like 20 years ago called Armored for Sleep. Um, and so not that that really played in any factor of me choosing this name, but we threw out a bunch of names and kind of whittled it down to three or four and ultimately said, you know what? Let's not mess with a good thing. It's not broke. Let's not fix it. Let's go with Armored by Grief. And that's kind of where we landed. Now, which was different than our first game, which didn't have a subtitle at all. And we kind of created that one. We tried to do the same thing this time around, just decided, nah, nope, this is Armored by Grief is too good.
Yeah, it's simple, it's impactful, it's catchy. It's despite my stumbling earlier, it is not a phrase I am likely to forget in the near future.
Absolutely. And that's kind of a theme. We were talking about this before we started recording. That's kind of a theme with a lot of our games is the names are very memorable and sometimes peculiar. And that's kind of what I like about the projects that we tackle. I try to pick stuff that, I think is going to resonate with people, but I kind of also just pick stuff that I like. And some of that comes from a catchy name. Like when I'm doing a little bit of research on what the next project is going to be, a catchy name will draw me into researching a game more. I mean, so, so far we've got Gun and Gun, we've got Embryo Machine, we've got Picaresque Roman, now we've got Convictor Drive, all very interesting names that you're probably not going to hear anywhere else.
Yeah, I've yeah, I've seen the designs for Embryo Machine. I don't think I've actually read any of the content, but there's some gnarly stuff in there.
There is. What's funny about Embryo Machine, we kickstarted that game in February of last year, and we kickstarted the board game adaptation, but it was actually a role playing game back in the mid to late ish 2000s from Group S&E. So it comes from some pedigree since Group S&E is so huge in the Japanese role playing scene. Yeah, it's just a little bit of fun backstory that it too is actually a tabletop role playing game.
There are a lot of really fantastic Japanese like indie TTRPGs that have not been translated. Tokyo Nova. But we're getting there thanks to people like you.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's funny is I don't think anyone really knows this until maybe right now. Uh, we've been around since 2018, and we've focused on a combination of board games, card games, and then we did our first TTRPG project last fall. But Convictor Drive actually starts our new initiative that'll run through 2023, 2024, and hopefully beyond, of where we focus almost exclusively on Japanese TTRPGs. So this Convictor Drive is kind of our first step forward in really becoming more of a TTRPG localization company and publishing company.
I'm glad to hear that because, like I said, there's some incredible stuff over there that like Japanese is a hard language to learn, man. I and it's hard to
Yeah,
learn that with TTRPGs because precise wording is pretty important.
it is, and there are so many cool books in Japan that the rest of the world just has never gotten to play. And there are some of us out there, so there are some companies doing our part in helping bring those over. But there's not enough. And so that's when I was looking at what we were going to do next year and beyond earlier this year, I really wanted to help shed more light on the Japanese role-playing game scene. That's what got me into this business in the first place. I was in video games localization, kind of want to do my own localization company, decided that the video game space was too crowded, jumped over to Japanese board games, and now I'm saying, you know what? People are doing Japanese board games more and more. More companies are publishing more Japanese board games. And my preferred tabletop genre is role-playing games anyway. So I kind of looked at the landscape earlier this year and said, all right, we're making a pivot and we're pivoting into the role-playing game space. And I'm excited to hopefully bring more attention to the Japanese role-playing game scene. I'm not the only one doing it. There's some awesome companies out there doing this as well. And I hope that we can all continue to bring these games over to the West.
Yeah, there's no shortage of content, especially with like 30 years of backlog at this point. Like, and
That's my thing. I'm not just focused on new stuff. There's a lot of old stuff that I play that I like, that's been around for 10, 20, 30 years that has never seen an English release. And, I want to be the company that taps into that and helps bring these pivotal titles that people probably have heard of, but they've never been readily available because no one's translated them. Because these things are massive, right? Most of the time, I don't think people are translating Japanese RPGs because they are huge localization endeavors. But I came from the video games localization space, specifically localizing visual novels and RPGs. So like big projects are not uncommon to me. And so that's, I took the first step with Picaresque Roman, wondering, is there an audience for this? And there was, even though, other games had come before Picaresque Roman, Ryutama and Shinobi Gami and a bunch of other stuff. But for me, it was like, this is a bit of a let's test to see if we can do this. And there was a really good response to Picaresque Roman. In fact, I was just talking about this on our Discord. It's been our best-selling game. And that was before it even came out to retail, and it's not even out at retail yet. So there's an audience who wants to play Japanese role-playing games.
It's another great example of really, really wild names.
Absolutely. Yep.
So I'm just looking at the cover of Convictor Drive with like the dude's like helmet half smashed off. That is wicked. What can you tell me about the setting of Convictor Drive? Armored by
Yeah. So
grief. Sorry.
yeah, yeah. So first off, tons of people have commented on how rad that cover art is. Um, the setting for Convictor Drive is unique. It takes place in a city called the Yokohama Zone, which is sort of repurposed Yokohama that's being used as sort of a prototypal city for this new technology called mechatronics engineering, which sort of came from research and tinkering around with semiconductor technology that just over time led to this thing called mechatronics. And so the Yokohama zone is a bit of a like a test bed for this technology. And so mechatronics has given way to quality of life enhancements through what it offers, like drone delivery, AI assistance. But then it also has been used for the building of exoframes, and these exoframes are sort of person-worn suits that can provide people with durability, strength, speed that they would not have had otherwise. And so while exoframes in the world of Convictor Drive have since proliferated to the rest of the globe, all of the research into exoframes is really happening inside the Yokohama zone. These exoframes, however, sort of have subcategories. So there are like the everyday exoframes that are used for, um, helping with construction because they give people, extra strength. And so they're used in very like practical ergonomic types of jobs. But then they're also broken down into combat exoframes, which are used by police forces and the Japanese military. However, there's another company, specifically within the Yokohama zone, that has a type of exoframe called a convictor. And now convictors are very special exoframes that cannot be piloted by just anyone. Any other exoframe can be piloted by anyone. A little bit of learning, a class, whatever, get your license, boom, you're done. Very much like driving a car. But convictors cannot literally be operated by people who do not fit a very specific criteria. So the only folks who are allowed to use convictors in the Yokohama zone are this company called Drive Private Security. Now, Drive Private Security is it was formed by the father of mechatronics and exoframes, Mr. Atami-san. And convictors can only be operated by folks who have experienced some type of significant loss or trauma. And the only way that the convictor suits can be operated to their maximum level is if the operator has experienced significant trauma, but then can tap into and in some ways relive that trauma, and the emotional output from experiencing or re-experiencing that traumatic event actually gives energy to the convictor. It's able to give a certain degree of energy that allows this specific exoframe, the convictor, to tap into a special ability that are exclusive to convictors called Convictor Drive, which is where the name comes from, which is this sort of unmatched power, speed, agility, durability. And when someone is in the state of operating in Convictor Drive while in their convictor, they can only do so for a maximum of about 30 minutes. Anything beyond that does harm to the operator. Of course, with all this really cool technology comes folks who are going to utilize that technology for nefarious means. And so while the baddies of the Yokohama zone recognize that there was no way for them to stand up to a convictor suit, they needed something to be able to match that power. And so there is sort of the antithesis of the convictor called deviators, which are used, made, manufactured, and employed by a rival company to drive. And that company isn't exactly ethical and is involved in a lot of underground types of activities that are not exactly legal. And so ultimately, the players who are Convictor pilots at Drive Private Security are going up against, yeah, maybe some common ruffians who might use some exoframes, but maybe beyond that initial scheme that's using just your everyday ruffian is someone who has the ability to pilot a deviator. And so it's this clash of these two very powerful pieces of technology. And that sort of gives rise to the main combat of the game. And there's a lot of lore that actually dives into like the particulars of the science behind all this. There's about 30 pages, 25, 30 pages of lore in this game that's just devoted to getting into the science behind it all, but then telling you about the Yokohama Zone, talking about the key people, the key players in the Yokohama Zone, the factions that are there, various companies. And so if you are a bit of a lore fanatic, there's a lot to dive into here, which is something that I love about Group SGR role-playing games, is they love the world building aspect, which is what primarily attracts me to RPGs. The systems, like whatever, I really get into the role play and the lore behind it all, and that really scratched the itch that I had, which is part of the reason why I wanted to localize Convictor Drive. And so if you're looking for a game with a really unique setting, world that does stuff that you're not going to see elsewhere, this is probably a game that's worth at minimum checking out.
Yeah, absolutely. I a world where you can tap into your like horrible trauma to inflict violence on people sounds abjectly horrifying.
I think it sounds horrifying because it kind of is horrifying. And you know, the lore doesn't pull back on what characters have to really go through to be able to pilot these things. You know, what I found so interesting about Convictor, and this was the primary thing that drew me to the game, is I liked that it did talk about trauma. It did tap into that very human experience. And in many ways, its systems or its world are kind of a metaphor for like, what do we do with trauma? How do we make sense out of trauma? How do we process through it? How do we get to the other side? How do we reconcile as much of trauma as we can? And then how do we use that to grow? And in the case of Convictor Drive, it's how do you use that to grow? And then also how do you use that to fight evil and, you know, in the name of justice and stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. So it's this paradox and sort of a tragedy that these individuals who are Convictor pilots are the only ones who can stand up to some of these big villains, you know, utilizing deviators to push their weight around and get their way in the Yokohama Zone. But to stand up for the people who can't stand up for themselves, they have to exact this huge cost on themselves. And they've got to, you know, and they do that by reliving, you know, this trauma over and over. Now, there is a part in the lore that kind of says that Drive employees and Drive management hopes that Convictor pilots are able to reconcile their trauma and sort of graduate out of that. Because once you do reconcile your trauma, you can no longer be a Convictor pilot. You no longer have the emotional response that you once did before you processed and reconciled that trauma, or at least made as much sense out of it as you could. Once you're able to do that, you can't pilot Convictors anymore. So there's like this really fascinating, deep, very humanistic element behind all the big theatrics of Convictor Drive, and I loved that dichotomy.
Also, the fundamental element of like you're only useful to a corporation as long as you're emotionally maladapted is again horrific.
Yeah, so then there's this really deep side of it where you're working to stop crime, right, and to fight the baddies, but you are very much so being used, right? And so there's a commentary there that I think is important as well. And so it's despite being a tokusatsu-inspired game, it's pretty emotionally complex, and I like that.
Yeah, I mean, some tokusatsu certainly is as well. Like, you know,
Yep.
some of the Kamen Rider series, not all
Yep.
of them, but
Yep, not all, but yeah, absolutely. They're. I don't want to paint broad strokes across tokusatsu that it's this silly thing because it's not. They're very serious tokusatsu shows, but this, you know, Convictor Drive leans into the seriousness a little bit more. That's not to say you can't have fun in this game. There are plenty of moments to have fun. There's plenty of moments that are lighthearted in the writing and in the book. that'll make you chuckle. And so it's not all, dark and bleak and depressing. It's more than that. Like I said, it's a pretty emotionally complex game.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and like there's the old adage for most RPGs that, a normal, well-adjusted person does not become an adventurer. And
This is very true.
it's very mechanical here. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what kind of person seeks out danger and puts themselves in harm's way repeatedly, right?
Yeah.
So there's a bit of a character study going on there about the human condition and who seeks those types of experiences out. And Convictor absolutely draws on that and leans into it.
Yeah. So I know the lore is the big deal to you and also to me to a certain extent, but how rules heavy is Convictor Drive?
Yeah, so I would classify Convictor Drive as probably light to medium crunch when it comes to rules, combat, numbers, stat crunching, that kind of thing. And yet, if you look at Group SGR's portfolio of games that they've produced, which I think now they're up to like a dozen or so different RPGs and murder mysteries because they've gotten into the murder mystery subgenre lately. But all of their stuff is accessible, very accessible. And in fact, a lot of Japanese TTRPGs are accessible. Most use like a D6 system. Most are really built around offering one-shot experiences. Convictor's a little bit more than that this time around. Picaresque Roman, our last one, was very intuitive, very accessible. This one's a little deeper and a little crunchier because it's not just designed for one-shots. It's meant for campaign play. It doesn't use a D6 system. It uses an original D10 system. Combat is a huge part of the experience, and character customization is a huge part of the experience. If we think about Convictors as being sort of like almost like mecha, you can imagine that mecha can be outfitted with all sorts of different parts and weapons. Well, the same thing is true for Convictors. They can be outfitted, and players will have to choose their customization options when they go into battle. Now, there are 4 character archetypes in the game: a runner type, a shooter type, a strength type, and an adept or balance type. But from there, you're not locked into a playstyle based on the archetype you've chosen. You've got a bunch of customization options where you can customize your head parts, your body parts, your leg parts, your arm parts, and your weapons. And so there are many different ways to play one archetype, which I like. However, in typical group SGR fashion, there's not so many options thrown at the player to where you get into a state of sort of analysis paralysis. So I love crunchy games, but sometimes I open up a new game and I'm like, you know what? No, I too many choices and I can't choose because there are too many. It's like when I turn on Netflix, I don't ever actually end up watching anything. I just flip through all the choices for 45 minutes. I sometimes feel that way with TTRPGs, and Convictor Drive has a really nice way of giving you the ability to build out and kit out your character how you want them to be without giving you too many choices. So it's deep, but not too deep. And I like that. Even the combat setting and how you handle combat is sort of handled in a very similar way. It takes place on a 3x3 grid. The bottom row is sort of like combat that happens on the ground. Your middle row is combat that would happen as you're running up a wall or on top of a roof of a short building. And then your top row is sort of like your high sky area, where you would be on the top of a super tall building or you'd be jumping through the air at great heights or something like that. And so even the combat setting itself and how you physically handle combat is done so in a way that it wants to. Convictor doesn't want to be its worst enemy. It doesn't want to be its own barrier to entry. And so it has a nice way of inviting you in with options, but not giving you too many.
I love the vertical grid. That is awesome.
Yeah, it's very cool.
It's rare that I encounter something on this show that I've like never actually seen before in a game, and I think that's one of those.
Yeah. I mean, it probably sounds like I'm just like in marketing mode or PR mode when I say this, but it is true. Group SGR comes up with games that I haven't played before. And it has mechanics that I've never experienced before. The same was the case with Picaresque Roman, which was this interesting PvP VGM system. And now we've got Convictor that kind of melds together ideas that we've probably seen before, but A, we've never seen them come together before, and B, there are some ideas thrown in there that just simply haven't really been done. That's really attractive to me in a genre that's very crowded right now and very hot. It's easy to feel a little samey, and it's hard to not feel samey. Convictor does not feel samey to me.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. Like, it's got the dark superhero thing going on, which is, we see a good bit of that, but like, I know the combat, like, I can absolutely see how that vertical grid is going to play into the kind of like wire fu sort of stuff that you imagine when you think of tokusatsu. Like,
There's a lot of emphasis on maneuverability in the combat, and a lot of that is vertically oriented maneuverability and what bonuses you get by being vertical or above a target, what you can do above a target that you can't do when you're on the same level or only slightly above a target. And so although you might see a 3x3 grid and say, well, how much strategic depth can there really be? When you kind of get into how each of those squares interacts with the other, you begin to see, hold on a second, this is deceptively deep, actually, in that Sigre-san made use of every single one of those 9 squares. I mean, the economy that he was able to get out of those single squares, 9 in total, is really quite impressive. And I say all the time that Sigre-san is the only one who can design his games. I think that's even seen in how combat is handled this time around in Convictor.
is SGR a single person group? Because I know that the first letter of each transliterated syllable there would be SGR.
Yeah, so it's primarily Sigre-san. However, he's got a team of folks that he regularly works with. A team of artists, for instance, that he'll go back to. Now, he typically won't release a book that uses the same team as the last one, but he might put 2 books between when he reuses a team. But it's primarily him, but he's got, at least one other assistant, and then he kind of freelances out the rest of the work. But he does the bulk of the writing. Now, Convictor's interesting because with Picaresque Roman, Sigre-san did everything from the mechanical side to the lore writing side. This time he brought in another TTRPG writer who's done a lot with Cthulhu to flesh out Convictor's world so that he could just focus on the mechanical side since Convictor is a little bit more of a crunchy game, comparatively speaking, to the rest of Sigre's work. And so this was a tandem project, which is unusual for him to share that workload with someone else.
Nice. And yeah, I can certainly see how somebody who has worked on, Cthulhu stuff would fit well with this project. Good lord.
Yeah. Yeah, that wasn't an accidental hire, I don't think.
Yeah. God, that cover is wicked.
It really is. The tear, the broken mask is just
like
next level stuff.
You look at that, you know exactly what this game is about.
You do, and then you pair it with the title.
Yeah.
And paints a pretty clear picture of what you're probably getting into.
This is fantastic. Yeah, so there'll be a link to the Kickstarter for this just below this video, either in the comments or the description, or probably both. Yeah, are there any other aspects you'd like to bring up while we're here of this somewhat horrific game?
Yes, this somewhat awesome and simultaneously terrible game, lore-wise, and what you're putting your characters through. I would say for the English release, I want people to know this. We did this with Picaresque Roman. We recommissioned pretty much all the art inside the book. The original book utilized art from various illustrators. I personally don't like doing that, and that was the case with our last TTRPG as well. So what I did is I hired the primary illustrator that worked on the original book, and I had them illustrate everything that is in the English release. So you get a nice standardized art style that's really evocative, really imaginative, very clean, really, really good stuff. So that's different for the English release. Just like with our previous TTRPG, we also redid the entire user interface and kind of graphical layout of the book. So that's brand new as well. And we worked with and consulted with Seagray-san on all of that. Of course, it's his game and his world and his vision, and so we like to work hand in hand with all the Japanese designers that we localize and publish their works of. And so he was a part of that process, and I think because of it, we've got a really, really tight, cohesive book that I'm really proud of. It's not super dense, but it's dense enough. And we've got some exclusives lined up for the Kickstarter that you'll only be able to get through the Kickstarter. We did something similar with our last project as well. And so we're carrying that forward here. And I would also like to say that Convictor Drive debuted at #1 on the Yellow Submarine TTRPG charts. And Yellow Submarine is the largest reporting metric for Japanese board games and tabletop role-playing games in Japan. And it debuted at #1 and sold through its first printing. It debuted, I think, in the summer. Got a second printing that fall. And then in Japan, it got a scenario book and a lore book. So this was a popular game, just like, a lot of Group SGR works. And so I'm really stoked to be able to bring it to the West, because unlike something like a Night Wizard or a Sword World, where people in the English TTRPG scene have probably maybe heard of, I don't think anyone's really ever heard of Convictor, despite the fact that it was kind of a big deal when it was released. And so I'm excited to be able to bring a #1, kind of best-selling work to the West and show people, hey, this is what's happening on the eastern side of the planet. And it's a unique game. So I'm excited for people to check it out. There'll be a nice sample for folks to download. I think the sample's like 40 pages or so. So you'll get a little bit of rules, a little bit of lore, a little bit of art, and a little bit of combat breakdown to give you a clear kind of picture of what this game is all about and what to expect from it.
And it's good timing with Kamen Rider Black Sun currently storming most of Twitter.
I won't say timing is everything, but timing is important.
Yeah. I do have one last question about the translation. Since this is so heavy on like depictions and characterization of trauma, was there a lot of like cultural retouching you kind of had to do to deal with the like different attitudes between Japan and the Anglosphere?
There was. So, we are a localization company. And with localization comes ensuring that your product is going to be well received in the new territory that you're localizing it for. And that means adapting cultural norms sometimes. Transliteration absolutely has a time and a place, and localization does as well. So this isn't an either or thing that I think a lot of people think it is. This is sort of a both and type of situation of where we maintained as much as we could of the original Japanese, and also realize that, hey, this is for a different market, a different demographic, and there will definitely be some expectation overlaps there. And there will also be some distinct differences, and we need to be mindful of that, especially when we're dealing with a subject that is as sensitive as mental health and more specifically trauma.
Right. So we're talking more like author's notes than, stapling over stuff.
Yes. Yep.
Right on.
Yep.
I'm glad to hear.
Yeah, and so this game, it's got a lot of sidebar talk. So, you'll be reading through the rules, but then we've got some sidebar stuff that sort of highlights certain things. And we'll be offering 2 versions of this book, and sort of the more deluxe premium version, which comes with, like a leatherette cover, holographic words on the front, black ribbon marker, all that stuff. Also comes with our translation notes, or some of them. We can't fit all of our translation notes into a project, but in those translation notes, we'll be talking about things that we had to annotate, things that we had to, modify, and things that we felt were really important that were in the original release that we didn't want to shy away from when maybe other people would, and we didn't necessarily want to. And so we try to pull the curtain back, and this will be something going forward that you'll see from our TTRPG releases of offering sort of 2 versions of the book, but we try to pull the curtain back a little bit on the translation and localization process. In the back of the book, we did that with Picaresque Roman too. Whereas if you got the premium version, you got to read through kind of our thought process of how we did things, how we tackled certain subjects. Now that project in many ways was a little bit harder to tackle, just given the very nature of like what that game is about and what it stands for. And so that game was, I think, was a little trickier to maneuver around at times than Convictor Drive, but certainly there are elements in Convictor Drive that were not there in Picaresque Roman that we had to handle sensitively and delicately, and I think we did. And you'll be able to see some of that in our translation notes. So just something cool that we like to do. Growing up, there was a company that localized video games that included their translation notes or some of them in the back of the instruction manuals, and I wanted to emulate that in our releases and started it in earnest with Picaresque Roman and am continuing it with Convictor Drive.
Nice. I'm very glad to hear that. Less glad that now I'll have to buy the premium edition. But yeah, no, I love that kind of stuff. One of my favorite manga purchases is Ghost in the Ghost in the Shell volumes that come with all of the like translation notes and editor notes, and most of them are just like, if you want more on this, go read this paper and then editor's note. This is out of print and has never been published in English. It's like, great, thanks.
Yeah, we try not to do that.
I appreciate that. I appreciate it nonetheless. But
Yeah, definitely.
yeah, no, this looks like a fantastic game. Again, the cover, I can't get past that. I'm looking forward to this. And once
Oh,
this
thanks.
video's and once this video's up, it should be live on Kickstarter. There'll be a link below. Please go back this. It looks really cool.
Yes, I would echo that. Please back it. Backing this project, like with Picaresque Roman, shows us that there is a market for this kind of thing, and it gives us the ability to do more. And we want to do more. And we've been talking and have contracts to do more with some pretty cool projects that I think people are going to be pretty stoked about. And but that's in the future. Convictor is now, and we've been doing this for a while. We don't churn out games quickly when it comes to TTRPGs. We've been working on Convictor for a long time now, and so we're really proud of what we've done, and we hope that people recognize the game's value and worth, and think it looks cool and interesting, and if nothing else, back it because you love that cover. Which, fun fact, is that cover, which we've used in sort of our pre-campaign marketing ads, has had the highest engagement of any of our projects. This is our 7th project, and so that cover, I think, you keep going back to how much you like it. It seems sort of like a universal thing that a lot of people like this cover a lot, and so the good news is as cool as the cover is, I think the game, what it does and what it means, is even cooler. So hopefully you get drawn in by the cover and then you stay for the content of the book.
I'm just saying, if you put that as, like, if you put a print of the cover as an add-on, that will sell.
Yeah, if posters weren't such a miserable, unbearable thing to have to try to print and ship, more specifically, this would be the game that you definitely would want to have a poster for. But because posters are miserable and unbearable to print and ship, I don't know if we'll be offering that. But hopefully you'll be able to display the book proudly on your shelf and show off that sweet art.
Excellent. Bradley, it's been great having you on. And yeah, no, this looks wicked. I don't know how else to put it.
Oh, Garm, I appreciate you having me on, and I'm glad you think it looks wicked. We think it looks wicked too.
And I hope that you do too, people who are watching this video and who are hopefully have this video still playing in another tab while you look at the Kickstarter, because you could go back this right now. You could do that.
Yeah, you could. You should.
All right. Have a good night, everybody.
Take care.